Hello, boys and girls. We are on our math lesson, adding and subtracting unlike fractions. And the cool thing about today is that we are taking two things that you already know how to do and putting them together to try a new skill. So if you remember in our lesson from last week, we found or learned how to find common denominators and how to make equivalent fractions using those common denominators. Whether we found a common denominator or the least common denominator, we found a multiple that our two denominators had in common, and we made equivalent fractions with those new denominators. We're going to take what we learned from that lesson along with what you already know about adding fractions, which is that you add the numerator, 5 plus 1 is 6, and then you slide that denominator over. And we're going to put it together with what we learned last week about adding fractions with unlike denominators. And something I just wanted to point out really quickly, if you see a fraction written like this or like this, it's the same thing. It's just written two different ways. This is still 5/12 plus 1/12. You'll probably see on your assignments fractions written this way because I tried to do them this way and they didn't load for everyone. So this is probably how you'll see your fractions written on your assignments. Don't let that trick you or anything. It's still the same exact fraction, just written a different way. So you are more than welcome to write your fractions either way. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Our first problem is an addition problem, and it is 3/4 plus 3/10. So what is the first step that we have to do? Because we cannot add fractions with unlike denominators. That's right. We need to find a common denominator. We talked in our last lesson about how to find the least common denominator, but I want to show you something. You don't always have to find the least common denominator. You can multiply your denominators to find a common denominator. Unless I specifically ask you to find the least common denominator, you are more than welcome to use any common denominator that the two numbers have in common. So we'll do it both ways. The least common denominator I know is 20, but if you were unsure, you could write out the multiples of 4, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and the multiples of 10, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and circle the least common multiple, which is 20. So that's going to be our least common denominator. But 40 is also a common denominator between 4 and 10. So you can use either of those numbers, unless on like an assignment, if I tell you to use the least common denominator, that's when you have to list out all the multiples. But if it just says a common denominator, you are more than welcome to just multiply your two denominators in order to find a common denominator. So let's try our first one with 20. So we need two fractions with 20. So see how this looks very similar to last week's lesson? We're doing the same thing, except there's an addition sign instead of a comma. So how did we get from 4 to 20? We multiplied by 5. And whatever you do to the bottom, you must do to the top. So since we multiplied by 5 on the bottom, we're going to multiply by 5 on the top. So what is 3 times 5? 15. And how did we get from 10 to 20? We multiplied by 2. So what are we going to do to our 3? Multiply by 2. And 3 times 2 is 6. So if we add 15 plus 6, we get, well, let's see. 6 plus 5 is 11. So we would have to carry a 1. And 1 plus 1 is 2. So we would get 21 over 20. This is actually an improper fraction, and so we would change this to a mixed number. We're going to work more on this in our next lesson, but basically I would say, how many times does 20 go into 21? One time. So I have a big 1, and then 20 minus 21 is 1, so I would have 1 over 20 left over. Basically, you're just dividing and putting that remainder as a fraction, which we learned a couple chapters ago. So we did it with 20. I'm going to erase it, and we're going to do it with a denominator of 40. Alrighty, so if you picked your denominator to be 40, you would do the same exact thing. How did I get from 4 to 40? I multiplied by 10. So whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So now I have 3 times 10 is 30. And now I do the same thing on the other side. How did I get from 10 to 40? I multiplied by 4. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So now I have 3 times 4. I get 12. I add, and I have 42 over 40. And you could do the same exact thing you did last time. 40 goes into 42 one time, and then you would have 2 out of 40 left over, which could be reduced, which just means you can keep your 1 the same. And then your 2 and your 40, how many times can 2 go into 2? 1 time. So basically we divided by 2 on the top, so we've got to divide by 2 on the bottom, and 40 divided by 2 is 20. So we got the same exact answer, no matter what denominator we used, as long as it is a common denominator between our first two denominators. Alrighty, we are going to do a subtraction problem together now. And guess what, guys? It's the same exact steps, except with a subtraction sign instead of an addition sign. So our subtraction problem is 6/8 minus 2/10. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And this time, we're just going to try it by multiplying 10 times 8. This is how we would find a common denominator, but not necessarily the least common denominator. So if we have 10 times 8, that is 80. So we're going to make 2 new equivalent fractions, which means they're the same. We're just increasing them by a certain amount with a new denominator of 80. How did we get from 8 to 80? We multiplied by 10. Whatever you do to the bottom, you must do to the top. So now we need to multiply 6 times 10, and we will get 60. How did we get from 10 to 80? We multiplied by 8. So we need to do the same thing to our 2, and 2 times 8 is 16. So we have 60 minus 16. We'll have to regroup. Our 0 becomes a 10. Our 6 becomes a 5. 10 minus 6 is 4. 5 minus 1 is 4. So 44 would be our numerator. And what would our denominator be, guys? That's right, 80. You just slide that denominator over. Now, this fraction is not in simplest form. That means these two numbers have multiples or are divisible by the same number. What is the number that could go into both of these numbers? I know for a fact 2 can go into them. So I'm going to start to try to reduce this number. And you should have worked on this last year some. So this may be a refresher. But we start with our fraction, 44 over 80, right? And I'm going to start by dividing the top by 2 and dividing the bottom by 2. Because remember, whatever you do to the top, you got to do to the bottom. Same goes here as when we are changing our equivalent fractions. So 44 divided by 2 is 22. 80 divided by 2 is 40. 2 goes into those numbers again. So I'm going to divide by 2 again. What is 22 divided by 2? 11. And 40 divided by 2 is 20. I know that 11 is a prime number, so I know that my answer in simplest form is 11 over 20. Now, if I would have started off with the number 4 as my common factor that I wanted to reduce by, I wouldn't have had to reduce twice, right? However, I didn't realize that the number 4 went into it right away. And that's okay. It just means I had to reduce a second time rather than being able to reduce on the first time. We will work on simplifying fractions more with our lesson tomorrow and over the next couple of days. But if you have any questions about today's lesson, please let me know. You do have a short assignment below this. I think it has 3 questions on it for you. 1 addition problem, 1 subtraction problem, and then 1 asking you to make the fraction in simplest form. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You will also have your mid-chapter quiz on Wednesday. It is open notes, so if you have any notes at home, please use them on it. If not, go back and rewatch some videos, take some notes before you take your quiz, okay? Remember, message me if you have any questions, and I hope that you have an amazing rest of your day.